I'm Trevor Williams with Global Atlanta, and we, again, are here at Refuge. No more appropriate place than to talk about the resettlement of the Somali refugee community here in Atlanta, and as well as Nashville, we should say. And we got started a little bit late, but hopefully we're enough on time to keep y'all engaged. You saw us ordering coffee here. If you don't know about Refuge, it started in Clarkston, which is kind of the epicenter of the refugee community. Started as a coffee truck. I think they've now got a physical location, right, in Clarkston, as well as here. We are in Sweet Auburn on Auburn Avenue, very close to the Global Atlanta offices at Constellations, which are 2 doors down. So this was very convenient for us, very easy, and very nice of Refuge to open the space for us for this timely and appropriate discussion. I'm here, we're here for our Authors Amplified book talks. Some of y'all have attended before. Jerry, thanks for being here again. But we're working our way through spotlighting authors here in Georgia that have something to say on international affairs or international issues. And I think this is the 8th one in the series. Y'all can correct me if I'm wrong, but it's been a fascinating journey. We have to thank our friends at the Atlanta Global Studies Center. I think Shebnem Oskan is on the call. Shebnem, I can't see you, but if you're there, hello. Thank you for your support of the series, and just in general, you've been such a great help. I do want to also thank again Refuge Coffee and Constellations, which has supported us through this time as well as we launch these book talks. So who are we here with? We're here with Dorian Brown Crosby, and Dorian has written a fascinating book called Somalis in the Neo-South. I don't know if you can see it, but African Immigration, Politics, and Race. And I'm going to give that back to Dorian so I don't take it as precious cargo. It's a look at, again, the resettlement of the Somali community here in Atlanta as well as Nashville, and kind of looking at how that compares to other communities around the country, other Somali communities around the country that have come. And we'll talk about why you got that idea and how that got going. But I wanted to introduce you a bit first. This is what I found amazing, that you're a political science associate professor at Spelman College. And it took me a minute in the book to understand why a political scientist was writing this book, but I got there and I totally get it now. And I want you to explain that. But she got her PhD in political science from Clark Atlanta University. Her research is focused on resettled African refugees in the United States Southeast. And I'm going to skip over some of the more academic stuff here. But this is a 20-year project for you, right?
Well, the work was 20 years.
The book was more recent, but yes, the work was 20 years. So what captivated you 20 years ago that got you so interested in continuing this?
Well, first of all, I just want to say thank you, Trevor and Global Atlanta and everyone for coordinating this. Thank you to all my folks that are here from the community, new friends that I've met. Thank you, Direction Copy, for supporting this event, and everyone that had anything to do with this happening. Thank you. I don't get in trouble.
That's right.
But really, my work did begin in Clarkston, Georgia, around 1998 when I was working on my dissertation. And I was searching for a topic. As you said, I'm a political scientist. And so I was definitely geared towards something that was very much related to government and politics, et cetera. But I also knew that I wanted to have a topic that satisfied my soul, and not just something to complete. And I was in the International Affairs office, and I heard that there was going to be a speaker there from Somali who was from Boston. Oh, that's interesting. So one of my advisors advised me to encourage me to go to the seminar, to the workshop, introduce myself, and just kind of see, where it led. Well, it led to a job in Clarkston for the resettlement agency. Back then, it was called Newcomers Network. The name has changed several times, but the mission remains the same. And so that Somali woman was, I lost contact with her, but she was my umbilical cord into the community. And so she and I worked together at the resettlement agency, and then she introduced me to the community. So I went to Somali weddings, I ate them. I was just like, ooh, this is wonderful. So they really, really embraced me very early on. And the the more I interacted with them, the more I was around them, and the other refugees in the community, I really got even more intrigued about, well, how are they here? Why are they here? Who's helping them?
Yeah.
Who's meeting their needs? You know, what's really happening with the community? And from there, my personal and my
Scoot it over maybe a little bit. Like, if it were on this side, it might work better, but it's okay.
I just need to do this.
Here. Wait, switch seats.
Okay.
That'll be better because you'll be talking to me.
Okay, that'll work.
Does that work?
Is that better? It's better. Okay. Thank you so much. Technical difficulties.
That's right. That's
resolution. Right. Okay. So yes. So I was really engaged with the community, and I began to just realize that the women's voices were not heard. I was hearing the stories.
Yeah.
From the women that I was working with as an outreach coordinator, and they were just so. They were sad, but they were also triumphant because I, as a graduate student, had my own gripes and concerns about, oh, I have to stay up and write and I have to do this. And when I heard their stories, I was like, oh, I
chasing you pretty quickly.
Yes, I have nothing to be concerned about. And so that really kind of compelled me to tell their stories because I said, nobody knows this, you know, just at least from my circles of conversations with folks. Nobody knew about this, and no one was talking about these refugee women. Again, it applies to most refugee women, but this was my entry point into their world.
Well, tell us about your approach to this work. Well, first of all, give us a little bit of a primer on why were they here? Why are they here? What was happening in the world at the time that they were fleeing Somalia or being forced out, as the case may have been? And how did they end up here in Georgia? Because one of the things I love about your book that I don't think is necessarily written in the dust jacket or whatever is that you really describe from A to Z what the refugee resettlement process is like. And I don't want you to do that right here, but you'll have to buy the book for that. But I think it's a really great primer that everybody should have in a way. So tell us, bird's eye view, how did they get here? And then by what process were they led to Georgia rather than somewhere like Minneapolis where there's a big Somali community already?
Well, yes, the very, very short version is in 1991, there was a civil war, and the United States is and always has been a resettlement country, which means most of the countries that have resources that are found in the West will take in the 1% of refugees that are resettled. That's another misnomer that all refugees, they are not. Only 1% of the 80 plus million right now are resettled.
Refugees or IDPs right now, right?
Yes, but refugees, internally displaced persons, are those persons who are still in their country.
Right, exactly.
They have not left. Refugees are those persons who have experienced a disruption in their life, but they are now in another country.
Right.
And because it tends to be further away from their familiar surroundings, it makes the challenges of everything sometimes. But nevertheless, so there was a civil war. The United States was at that time the leading country to resettle that 1%. And the process really, I can just break it down from the international to the local.
Yeah, sure, that'd be great.
So UNHCR, the United Nations High Commission for Refugees, will their work, as we know, is global, and so people will come to them and say, I have need of refuge. They have to meet the criteria, which means you're fleeing because you feel that you'll be persecuted for religious reasons, etc. And so once UNHCR identifies you, they vet you extremely closely to make sure you are who you say you are, and that you are actually fearful for your life.
This is one of the reasons there's only 1% that get resettled, right?
Right. So once they clear UNHCR will then say to the United States, we have some people that we think would that you all could resettle. Then the United States says that's fine, but we have our own criteria, our own vetting process, which again takes more time. So contrary to popular belief, it is not a quick turnaround. It takes years. So once they have cleared the the United States level, which is the federal government, so Department of Homeland Security, Department of State, and Department of Health and Human Services. I won't go into all of those bureaucratic.
You have a glossary of all the
right.
all the bureaucratic
and
things.
So once they are cleared on the national level, the federal government, then there's a refugee coordinator in every state that participates, and Georgia is one of those states. So the refugee coordinator will reach out to resources, resettlement agencies in the area and say, we have X number of refugees who are coming into Georgia. We need you to sponsor them and help them. And that means they help them get all those basic resources, food, clothing, shelter, water, medicine, etc. And then on the local level is where the faith-based community, individuals, nonprofits, etc., that's where the rubber meets the road. That's where the work really happens, because people are trying to adjust to a brand new life and they need help. Yeah.
Well, talk about your approach. You mentioned your struggles as a college student, right? And how that paled in comparison to what so many of them have gone through. But you mentioned in the book that you take I can't remember the technical term for it, but as a researcher, you're kind of putting yourself in the story in a way. You're declaring your biases, you're declaring your own experiences, and you're showing how those lived experiences help you kind of relate to the people, the subjects of the research, in this case, the Somali community. Talk about your experiences as a Black woman in the South and how that really informed what you were doing and how that may be different from other research that's out there about the Somali community.
Well, one of the ways is that because of the socially constructed racial categories of Black, when African refugees or immigrants come into the United States, they're automatically lumped into that category, which means their treatment is very similar to what African Americans experience. And so it means that I had a kinship and understanding that we may be from different countries and different cultures, but because you are in the United States and those labels are placed on you, I can relate to you as a woman, I can relate to you as a woman of African descent, and I can understand that you want to maintain all of your heritage, your culture. I respect and I understand that you are a Muslim, so you have the right to practice your religion. So all those things are a part of, especially being a native Atlantan and having parents that were involved in the civil rights movement. I've heard those stories. My parents marched with Martin Luther King Jr. My father went to jail with Hosea Williams to desegregate the richest department store. My church, Mount Moriah Baptist Church, my home church, was one of those central churches that was a part of the mobilization and the organization of the African American community at that time. So I had an idea of what they were experiencing, but at the same time, I think you're mentioning the concept of reflexivity, which means that even though I understand and have experienced and know that my people have experienced discrimination, I'm still from the United States of America.
Right, exactly.
And so I still have access to resources that other people may not have access to. And I have to make sure that I acknowledge that.
Yeah. And you talk about the layers of identity that Somalis in particular have to go through, especially women, right? But then you kind of start at the top, being a refugee, Black refugee Muslim woman, right? And the way that creates an impediment to your resettlement. And I love the way that you phrase it in the book. You're kind of looking at it not as we're just resettling, we're looking for a way to thrive in a new environment. And that to me seems like it's the heart of your book. And you have, I think, 22 families or individuals that you follow, that you interview throughout the book. So tell us how people negotiate those identities and what that looks like in the South right now. And this is where it's going to get into why a political scientist is doing that.
Well, let's see, can I condense this? The political, economic, social, psychological structures that are in place in the United States are very much embedded in the South. And there is a particular idea as to who is, number one, an American. And number two, that also equates to who is a Southerner. And those identities do not match who Somalis are.
Right.
And so the struggle is—
You can say it, it's people that look like me. You can say it, it's okay.
But and I want to be very clear, it is not that I'm trying to paint a broad picture.
No, I got you.
Everyone
it's the structural part of it that you're talking about. Yeah, and the political part.
Right, and the political part. and then the public policies that feed the social attitudes, et cetera, it makes it very challenging to resettle in an area where, number one, you're still trying to figure out the language, you're trying to understand the culture. What is that? We don't really know what American is. And then I also mentioned that when we say American, that's also a very narrow view because we live in the Americas.
Right.
So people could think, well, South America, Central America, but we just automatically think America in terms of the United States of America. So all of those structures that are in place to exclude people from accessing resources and the social attitudes that go along with those policies that also make those dichotomies of us and them, you're the outsider, you're the other, are exacerbated by the fact that when Somalis and other African refugees try to hold on to their culture, because remember, they have left abruptly.
Right.
So their culture is really all they have to remember, especially the elders.
Yeah, and when you're a refugee, you're not going back, right?
Exactly.
Like there's no going back. It's you've had to leave your homeland behind, unless some crazy change of circumstance with the government happens, maybe to welcome people home years later, but you're probably not going home. Which I think is it's sad to think that people who don't have a home to go back to can't feel at home here. And I want to know how you view the term Southern hospitality. Because you keep talking about in the book, like that there's this promise, especially people in Dadaab camp in Kenya, the refugee camps, they're looking at America as this promised land in a way that is going to welcome them in. And then they get here and the reality might be different, even here in the place that's home to the civil rights movement and prides itself on being hospitable and the city too busy to hate, right? So how have you negotiated those terminologies for Atlanta?
Well, it's complicated. It's complex. It's historical. It's political. It's economic. It's all those things. But it is a matter of taking everything on a case-by-case basis and confronting the issue, if there is one, or the circumstances for what is happening right then, right there. And even though there is a general idea of the challenges, everyone's individual experience is different. And that's something else that I think people forget when we talk about refugees, even coming from the same country. They are diverse. So they come from different backgrounds. They may have different educational levels. They may have a different level of English proficiency. So they are diverse. And so everyone has their own need that needs to be met, and you kind of have to approach it from that perspective.
Tell me why you say the Neo South, because that's a unique term. Like what? Because we got the old. I mean, I sort of have my ideas about it, but I want you to explain it to the audience because I think, we got the Old South, which everybody pretty much knows what that is. Here in Atlanta, I went to the Grady College of Journalism. Let's talk about that. But so there's this idea of post-Reconstruction of the New South, and then you've coined, I don't know if you coined it or you've used it, the Neo South. What's the difference between the New South and the Neo South?
Well, as far as I know, I coined
besides by about 130, 140 years.
Right. So as I said, as far as I know, I coined the term. And if it is already out there, it's not applicable to exactly what I'm talking about, I don't think. So I'll just put that disclaimer out there now.
Good. You heard it here first.
Right. But for me, Neo South was in just, as I said, working with and just being in the midst of the communities in Nashville, in Clarkston, in terms of Somalis, but also in Clarkston of the other African refugee and immigrant communities. I realized that, yes, some things have changed, and yes, we have moved from the Old South to the New South. But even now, as Atlanta and the Southeast is growing and changing and becoming more multicultural, the old mentalities are still very much embedded in the South. So that's kind of where I came up with the Neo South, because it's not in terms of, as you're saying, the periods of history. It's not the Old South, it's not the New South, but yet as things have changed and as time has moved forward, some of those mentalities are still stuck in
Mhm,
the
mhm.
old South, but so that's kind of where.
But then the New South was coined as a response to post-Civil War Reconstruction, right? We need to come up with a new industrialized South that that is able to adapt to the new environment that we live in. We're defeated. We have to kind of negotiate the new landscape. And so I'm curious because that it seems like that carried over really until the 60s, you know, this idea. And you had like, and I'm selfishly taking prerogative here because I'm walking around Sweet Auburn all the time. I'm working on stuff related to this street. And it seems to me that there was kind of 1880s on, like 1910s, there was kind of a flourishing of Black political activism that then had a reactionary effect that happened in the South. And that's when you got monuments, et cetera, right? But is that your understanding of it too? That it kind of took really?
Yeah, so you're right. The monuments did not start showing up until well after the Civil War, and we had moved into different decades, but there was still going back to the concept of who is an American and who is a Southerner, and how the South is very much still beholden to those ideas. And so now, even as I said, even though things have changed and we're growing, some things have just remained the same.
So you talk about this was a 20-year labor of love, but you really started doing the core research 4 years ago or so. And this was, you know, during the Trump administration. And you were talking about, you use the word nativism a lot, and that gets into what you're just talking about, this idea of who is an American, who is a Southerner. Tell us what it was like doing that research then, and how you feel the responses you got from the community may have been different than if it was in a different time.
Oh, I'm using this. Okay.
Yes, I'm using that. Okay.
So I literally have to eat it right now. So yes, it was very challenging because at that time, you know, that the executive order was already out, which we commonly know as or refer to as the travel ban, and it targeted Somalia as one of those countries.
Right.
So it meant that many of the Somali families remained separated. And so even though we have laws in place to say, well, if you have an immediate family member who is in a refugee camp or who is not with you, you can go through the process, a lengthy process, and sponsor them to come to the United States. Well, with the travel ban, it meant that none of that was happening. And so families remained separated. And it also meant that when in Nashville and in Clarkston, there were some people who were very, very opinionated about what was taking place. But then there were others, and I think this was probably more so a broader perspective. They were terrified. And even before I started the research and when we were going through the election, people were actually just terrified that if he were to win, what would happen to them, because they had no real assurance that things were going to either stay the same or get better. For them, it was going to be extremely worse. Right. So, you know, as I say in the book, I'm very much indebted to the community in Nashville and in Clarkston, because they really opened up to me at a time where they were beginning to really feel the heat from the government that took them in and was supposed to protect them and provide them, as we talked about before, with this wonderful perception of a better life. And now they had targets on their backs. And so that was very, very challenging for them, I should say.
But I should say that wasn't a new thing, right? They had experienced that before, because with Somalia being designated a state sponsor of terrorism, and then you have 2001, September 11th, many of them coming after that. Some came before, but some came after. There was this conflation of the word Somali with terrorist among some people, right? And so did they feel that they were kind of sadly prepared for that in a way because they experienced that before?
Well, I don't think that they were prepared for the onslaught of what was coming, which is why they were terrified, if he got into office. But they certainly were used to being labeled as terrorists, as pirates. And that was really another one of my reasons for wanting to write the book, was because the Somalis I knew were nothing like that. And I was just very upset that the whole narrative about them being in the United States was a negative one, and it just was not true. And that's not to say that there aren't some folks who, take those extremist views, or who take the ideas and the ideals that they hold to a violent, or express it violently. But that also doesn't mean that all Somalis condone that behavior. And that's something else that came out, is that all the participants were extremely adamant about making sure that it was known that they do not condone violence. They do not condone that extremist behavior. And so it really was somewhat of a slap in the face to them to think that everybody thought that they were in agreement with this behavior.
Tell us too, because I think one of the misunderstandings or misperceptions about the refugee community is that it gets conflated with the economic migrants. And I want you to explain you've explained the rigor with which they're screened. You have not explained the fact that they have to be self-sufficient within, say, 6 to 9 months, and that they do a lot of jobs that Americans are not doing. Tell us about what the economic prospects look like for someone coming here. What kinds of jobs are they working in? What's their kind of path to mobility? Because you talk a lot in the book about how many of them do this intra-country migration, right? You may be resettled in Clarkston, but you may end up in Ohio or Tennessee, or somewhere that is, in your opinion, less crime-ridden, or gives better opportunities for your kids or something like that. So tell us about the economic aspect of it, because I think that's at the fear of displacement from a economic perspective. If it's not the real reason, it's at least used as a reason that people that look like me sometimes are saying that they don't want people to come in from other countries.
Well, that is definitely a misnomer. Somalis, and I will take the liberty of saying many other African refugees, are not here for a handout. They are simply looking for assistance with getting themselves back on their feet. And many Somalis, particularly women, are entrepreneurs. So if you go to many of the malls, the Somali malls in Minnesota, where I got some wonderful bangles from there. But if you go to the mall in Minneapolis, or if you go into the mall in Clarkston or in Nashville, most of the stores are owned by women. And so, yes, they are afforded initial resources, federal resources, and maybe some state resources. But the misnomer is that the mentality is that this is where they want to remain. That is not true. It is the fact that I want to get here. I really had no choice. First of all, I was uprooted. I'm thankful and grateful to be here, but I am a self-sufficient person. I was in Somalia, and I want to be that in the United States.
So what do you make of the outpouring of support for Afghan refugees at this moment? How does that hit with you, having researched this community for 20 years and seeing the struggles that they faced? Of course, we all want to welcome the Afghans, right? And especially when they've helped us with this war effort, right? But I think this gets at the heart of the role of the larger economic and military powers in potentially creating, if you go back far enough in history, some of the conditions that have led to the refugee crises, right? It's easy to see with Afghanistan. It's not so easy to see from our perspective with Somalia. But how does this land with you? I mean, does it mean that we have evolved in a way, or is it different because it's a different type of person?
Well, first off, let me say, as you said, from a humanity perspective, we definitely are concerned about any person who is in need of those basic resources. And we are always in agreement with welcoming them into the United States and providing that assistance however, whenever, wherever we can. The difference is that, as I mentioned before, because of those racial categories, which are, of course, also based on skin tone, skin color, all these other nonsensical things. But it means that just looking at a person, they are automatically placed into that racial category that's constructed to mean white. So that means resources are more available to them than African refugees because they are automatically lumped into that category of Black. And so even in trying to become self-sufficient, those are some challenges, because if they go for a job and if their level of English is not at a strong level, which is the case with many refugees, also from Somalia, that the level of English proficiency is not at a level so that they can enter into those professional jobs, even if they may have been an accountant in Somalia. They cannot just walk into those positions in the United States. You know, we have credentials and processes, et cetera. So, yes, so it means that there is more assistance available for refugees who are not from Africa, because the United States still has this idea of, first of all, who Africans are. Yeah. And then that is made worse by the fact when you talk about the stigmas that are placed on being refugees.
Is there a way to quantify that? I mean, I don't want to challenge you too much, but I want to push back a little bit. Like, how do you know that it's based on skin tone and racial categories versus just being a Muslim or being, all these other identities that we're talking about? Has anybody done research on that to check into that? I'm just curious about it.
Oh, yes. There are several studies that talk about, particularly for women, when we talk about intersectionality and those different layers that women have to deal with. And that means that when they are navigating a new country, those spaces, when they walk into a room to even access government resources, it's not necessarily an issue of who are you as a person. It is, I automatically see how you are dressed. So I know that you're a Muslim. I see that your skin tone is of a certain complexion. So I just assume that you are African. So all those things are based on assumptions and misnomers. And yes, there are lots of studies, either coming from a women's studies perspective or ethnicity perspective, racial politics, et cetera. It's definitely out there.
Great, I'll have to do more research. So I'm going to ask one more question, then we're going to open it up both to the audience here and the audience on the virtual call. And so if y'all want to type your questions into the chat, I'm going to bring this thing over to Aurora and let her ask the question, so that our people here in the audience here can hear as well. If you talk a lot about politics in the book, and I just want to leave it from my perspective with this, like, what would you? It seems like refugees are used as a pawn in politics. What would you like to see change about the way that politicians talk about this situation?
So glad you asked that, Trevor. My current research is looking at that, to say that refugees, particularly from Africa, they may be refugees now, but at some point when they gain their citizenship, they will be your constituents. So you need to pay attention to their issues, their concerns. And even if they have a spokesperson from the community who is conveying, which we saw in Nashville, even if you have a spokesperson who is conveying the community's issues to an elected official, it still means that they are voters, and you need to pay attention to what they say, which means I would like to see more politicians go into those communities, like literally go into the communities to hear what they have to say, and then take it to heart.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
If Aurora, you just let me know if any questions come in on the virtual. Does anybody here have any questions for Dorian? Yep, Jerry.
Well, thank you very much for the talk. I was curious, you mentioned the faith communities, and you may have touched on this, but is that kind of one of the foundational forces of the community here in Atlanta and Nashville and potentially other communities? Is it because of the faith communities?
Why people are being resettled here, I think
or how much the faith community really is driving a lot of that portion of it.
We know a lot of the agencies have a faith component to them, right? A lot of the resettlement agencies. So he's asking, I think, about,
I was just curious, maybe there's no correlation, direct correlation.
is there a correlation between that and the fact that people come here?
Well, I think for the faith-based communities, it does come more so from the humanity perspective. So no matter what religion you practice, one of those central components is be good to one another, love one another, see about each other. And so many of the churches, particularly Lutheran, Catholic, they have their own agencies that work with resettled refugees from anywhere in the world. So that's why you tend to see many of those, as we say, enforced migration, many of those faith-based organizations, because it's coming more so from the humanitarian perspective as opposed to the political perspective.
Anybody else here? Any on the call yet? Yeah. All right, I'm gonna bring you the mic.
We have one from Marilyn Davis. It is, what is the future of Somali refugees in local office holding? So I think like in government.
Yeah, that's a good point, because in the book you talk about Minnesota and how that's played out there and some other places.
Thank you, Dr. Davis. Right. No, that's my former professor, so that's why I had to give her a shout out. So yes, I see the future as number one, let me take it this road. For the women, they are participating in both Nashville and Clarkston in what political science would call maybe an informal way. So they aren't running for office. I shouldn't say all of them, but some of them are working on campaigns, but most of them are not seeking that office. But they are watching the news, they are having conversations, even though those conversations may be separated by gender, but they are still having those conversations about politics in the United States and Somalia. And so what it means is that Representative Ilhan Omar has really, really set a strong example for the younger Somali women to say, yes, you can be Somali. Yes, you can embrace your culture. And at the same time, you can adapt to where you are. That is, if you were resettled in the U.S. as a child, but many of them may have been born here. Right. So it's a way to say, don't be afraid to get involved and engage, because in the book I talk about community-informed politics, which resembles what we talk about normally as grassroots politics in the political circles. So it really means that there's community engagement. So for the women, it means finding a way to figure out what that participation looks like that's most comfortable for them. Because again, we don't want to push them outside of their cultural comfort zone. It's a step they would have to take on an individual basis. And then the men would have to support that. So altogether, I would say that the future would look very much in the South, starting with Clarkston and Nashville, as what we've seen in Minneapolis. But it will take much more organization. It will take much more engagement with communities that they are comfortable with engaging. So for instance, because many Somalis are appreciative of, and as with many African immigrants, appreciative of the civil rights and social justice sacrifices that African Americans made, there is a great opportunity for political collaboration. Let's talk to each other. Let's figure it out. You don't necessarily have to do it the way we do it, but how can we help you walk that road and we can walk it together? So that's something else that I talk about in the book, is that there are a lot of opportunities for a Pan-African approach where we can not just only bring in Somalis connected to African Americans, but fold everyone into a mindset where we're talking about the same issues, and it's nothing that's unreasonable. Everybody wants to have a life of dignity. What's wrong with that?
Anybody else here or on the call? Okay. You want to go? Go ahead. Yeah.
Well, thank you, first of all. I'm very grateful for the work that you're doing and bringing the refugee life and their dedication to better life to light in a positive way. So I want to thank you as a former refugee, as a Somali woman, as a Black woman, as a Muslim woman who started from nothing when I came to the U.S. as a child, who didn't speak a lot of English. we do work hard. Everything that you said is true, and I'm not used to that. I grew up in the Midwest, and a lot of people don't say the positive side of refugees or women or blacks from Africa. So I want to take the opportunity to show gratitude to the work that you're doing and the positivity of this book. There's so much I can say, that I would like to say. There's no time for that, but I just want to make sure that you know that coming from a Black Somali refugee woman, that I'm grateful.
Amazing, amazing. Yeah. We're going to have her back for another panel, I think. And Lewis will ask your question. I think that might be the last one, but go ahead.
You're not from Somalia, and forgive me because I know she had a teaching award in 2017 at Spelman. But as a student, I've come totally unprepared. But did you find not being part of the culture, not actually living there, not actually restrictive in your research? Did you find that limiting? And how did you try to overcome it?
Yes, great question. First of all, I don't speak Somali, so there's the first issue. But when I was in high school, again here in Atlanta, I took Arabic for 4 years, and I didn't follow through with it when I was in college, to my regret. And so I knew enough to say, I probably will butcher it now, but I knew enough to say, hello, my name is, how are you? So even if I couldn't introduce myself or make an initial introduction in their native language, I could really try it in their religious language. And so, but because I had such great friends in the community in Clarkston, it was always very helpful because they kind of did the work for me to say, which we all know, you have to have that trust in the community. Otherwise they will not talk to you. But she did a lot of the legwork to say, I know her, she works with me. And so, like I said, I made many friends in the community. So that definitely was helpful. But in terms of navigating, yes, I really, I wish I knew enough Somali to talk to them in their native language, because the interviews probably would have carried more cultural tones than they did, because I would have understood what they were saying in their own language, and they wouldn't have to process it to relay it to me in English. They could just, really let it flow and speak. So yes, that's definitely one of the things that I wish I had, which I know was a limitation, was not being able to speak in their native language.
Yeah, I go through that every time I go overseas to do reporting. I go through this like banging my head against the wall, like wish I spoke the language, because it's having to be processed. I think we got one more online, then we're going to go close it out.
This one's from Katie Rhodes. What changes need to happen for Somali communities in the South to be treated more fairly?
That's a big can of worms.
That's a big. Thank you for that big question. Well, public policies will have to change, but that will depend on social attitudes, and the social attitudes inform the public policies. And I think there needs to be more organic interactions, conversations. Don't be afraid to sit in a space with someone that you don't know, or, just upon first glance, the stereotypes that you have been fed pop into your head, and that prevents you from opening up and having a true conversation with that person. And I think that just on that one-on-one organic basis, just like we're doing here this evening, just talk to each other. We're all humans. We all have our different opinions, but just because you have a different opinion does not make you a bad person or my enemy. We can have, yes, the universe loves diversity. I mean, obviously, because we're all different. So there's nothing wrong with that. The problem is when we place a value on those differences, and then you decide whose differences or whose difference is better or worse than someone else's difference.
And we're also guilty of that in some way. Yeah. Close it out. Come on.
It's more comments. I echo everything that Ian says. We truly appreciated everything you brought out. The passage is amazing. A lot of times, being refugee is really totally different. When you're born here and when you come here out of, it's not the same. But when you see a lot of negative towards you, you drown it. But to see the positive of Somalis is amazing. We appreciate you. And thank you so much. I just heard this event yesterday, last night. I was like, I'm coming. Thank you. Thank you.
Good. And that, I mean, that's the type of conversation we hope to have through Global Atlanta. And I know Refuge is built on this idea. Refuge Coffee was built on this idea of having dialogue over coffee with people that may not look like you or may think differently from you. So we hope to do more of these. Thank you so much, Dorian, we're going to give you a round of applause. And sorry about the technical difficulties early on, but hopefully we got it ironed out. We will be back with our next event next month. It's going to be with Lalit Dhingra, who is a former CEO of NIIT Technologies from India. And he grew his software business in Atlanta. He's written a memoir about his leadership journey. So we're going to talk about that with him next month. And then in January, we'll have another one for you. And we will send the recording and all of these links to you in the follow-up. So thank you again, Dorian, and hope to see you back at another one.
My pleasure.
Thanks. Bye.